Hello, and welcome back to E.G. the Virgo for our next chapter that's coming up. And I know it's been a while, so we're going to try to go right through this because this chapter, unlike the other one, or I think it was one or two of them that was kind of short, this one isn't too short. So, but you're going to really like this chapter. This is, again, our story, One Life, Five Generations, an unusual kind, that 1%, based on actual experiences and theories. This story includes entertaining fictional and non-fictional images, animations, videos, and music by artists and photographers unrelated and in no way were created for this particular story. Some names, dates, and times were changed to protect the privacy and identities of the characters within the story. This is volume 1. Okay, so let's get right into this. The first thing we're going to do is get our disclaimer out the way. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comments, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. This is from Source Circular 92, Copyright Law of the United States, 17 U.S.C. Section 107. Okay, so we're going to get right into it. I think you all are going to really like this one because this one is going to take you back, especially those babies born in between the 50s, the 60s, and being raised during the 70s, and maybe right on up to the early 80s. I would say about maybe 82 or 83, right about that time. It's going to be some things there and objects in this chapter that you're going to be like, wow, they went way back, I would say, like, for example, the electric football game that people used to play. I mean, the little boys really loved it. It was an electronic vibrating game where you put the men on top of the game. It was a metal board, and you had your fake audience here. This was your fake audience. And this was your actual timekeeper. And you had several different teams that you can put together if you wanted to play against each other. And what would happen is you would use this dial to see how hard you wanted the game board, which is this, to vibrate. And the men would move with this little furry cotton-like football under their quarterback's arm or whoever the runner was going to be. And they had to make it to the touchdown. And these are the type of games that we played growing up in the 70s. And then you have your 75 and 1 electronic game. And that was something, not a lot of people I knew had it, but it had like little wires to it where you can make different sounds. Sounds such as a doorbell, a car horn blowing, a truck backing up that makes the beep, 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 that kind of sound. And it had, you can make all different types of sounds, just like the sound of a bulldozer or a tractor, an alarm clock. And you would put these little wires in these little metal coils. That's what these were. It looked like metal springs, but metal coils. And they had like white wires, little skinny white wires, red, blue, and yellow. And I think the white wires were the longest and the red wires were the shortest, but you can make that. And then you would use this to turn on the whole thing and also to turn the sound up, because here's your sound box here, which was your speaker box. And this was where your batteries went, these were things that we played with that required real brain energy, creativity, and thought through the 70s, 60s, I say the late 60s, 70s, and right on into the early 80s. Maybe about, I wouldn't put it past 83. I think about anything beyond 83, it got into different types of things. But this chapter will show you items and products back from that time. And a lot of you will be like, oh, wow, I remember that growing up. Some of you won't, because some of you weren't during that time, and everybody had different experiences. So that's just to prepare you for what this chapter is going to have. Some of the things. That's why I think the chapter is going to be very interesting. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's see here. Okay, chapter 14. Still surviving cars at 8 years old. After such a fun week's vacation, E and her family decided a month later they would return to Philly for another visit. But this time around, the visit would only be for a weekend. However, any time at all was okay with E and her siblings, because they simply loved going to Philly, where they were all originally born, and for the most part, they all spent most of their childhood there and had more friends there that they missed. E was always ready to get away from the house for a while, from hearing the disembodied footsteps going up and down, I would say going up and down the steps of her home, inside her home. Now, she would hear these sounds, disembodied footprints or footsteps, every night, which sounded as though they would stop right in front of her bedroom doorway, and then it would start all over by sounding like they were walking back up the steps again. And it appeared only E could hear them, so a trip to Philly for any amount of time was never an inconvenience, and was always a welcoming place for E and her siblings to travel, because they only needed to pack very little for their weekend trip to Philly. E decided she would take some of her smaller things to play with and keep herself busy during the trip. E's mother told them they could bring what they wanted this time, but for them to remember it was only going to be for a weekend, and not to overdo it with too many toys, games, and other things. And with that being said, E already knew what items she was going to be taken to Philly. So they were all ready for these things. But E really didn't like the disembodied footsteps she heard almost every night that kept her awake. And she just couldn't figure, how is it that nobody else hears these footsteps but me? Again, as usual, E was very excited about going on another road trip to Philly. E decided to take a lot of small things for her to play with that could fit in her suitcase and in the trunk with no problem. She also knew it wasn't going to create a big problem for her dad to situate their suitcases in the trunk of the car. E decided to take many of her small past birthdays and Christmas items, like her metal skates, jacks, her hula hoop, which made the sound of beads being tossed around with a type of whippet sound. She also packed one of her many baby dolls, Baby Alive, which came with batteries, baby doll diapers, a feeding bowl, spoon, bib, extra clothes, and a changing cloth. Additionally, E packed up a few of her Fisher-Price Little People, along with a couple of Fisher-Price toy houses, Ferris wheel, minibus, family van, and car. So E was going to make sure that she got as many things as she could this time around. As you may have already guessed, E and her siblings was nothing short of toys, games, bikes, Barbies, doll babies, and etc. Their parents made sure none of them could ever claim boredom. E also bought one of her Barbie dolls with all its accessories, as her sisters would bring their box of paper dolls with clothes and all. E's sisters and their friends were about 8 years older than E and all enjoyed playing dress up with their paper dolls. Paper dolls back then were really creative for the older teen girls back in the 70s. It taught them fashion and design pretty much. They also needed a good hand and eye coordination because they had to cut the clothes out of the pre-printed pages in order to wrap them on the cardboard paper dolls. So these clothes were, on a printed page, and they would take these little things and wrap them around the shoulders of the cardboard doll to make it appear like the doll is dressed. And you see kind of an example of that up here, where they come like they have on a bathing suit, but then they put take these little edges here and fold them over their shoulder and around the waist part or the arms, and it looked like they're now wearing a dress. It was just a paper thing draped over the front of them. But that's the way it was back then. And I'm going to tell you, they really, the teenage girls really enjoyed it. The older teenage girls did anyway. E's brother decided he wanted to bring his basketball, a board game called Monopoly, in addition to a couple of other games called Trouble and Operation, along with a few of his little army men, and a paper football that's played on a table. By the way, this paper football is handmade, so you had to know how to fold that up and make it the right way. E and her siblings were very creative when it came down to games. All three of the board games that E's brother bought was basically their favorite: Monopoly, Operation, and Trouble. But again, these kids were so back in the 60s, 70s, and obviously, like I said, the early 80s, maybe up to 1983, talking about 1883. They actually had to use their creativity. There wasn't, computer games. There's nothing wrong with computer games because it does test your skills, but it also causes, your brain doesn't develop as fast and quick and as well when you have more hands-on strategic things or things that you have to create out of thin air. So this is what the E and her siblings was working with. So let's get on. Let's go moving on here. So now that they all decided what they were going to take for the weekend trip to Philly, it was time to hit the road. E's parents always liked starting their road trips very early in the mornings so they could arrive to their destination sooner than arriving in the afternoons or evenings. So now it's 6 a.m. in the morning, and they wanted to arrive in Philly no later than 6:30 or 7 a.m. because they wanted to get there in time enough to have a nice big home-cooked breakfast. As soon as they all arrived in Philly at their grandparents' house, E did her normal routine of running in first and yelling out everyone's name in the house one by one to let them all know that they had all arrived. And like every other house back then, all living room couches and chairs were all fitted and wrapped in plastic. That was done to preserve the furniture from stains and other damages that could happen during that time. It was also easier to disinfect, and clean. The only real drawback to plastic wrapped furniture back then was how the plastic was stick to your skin, depending on how warm it was in your home or living room. But like most kids and adults of that time, you grew to become used to it. Actually, the plastic wrap worked very well because whenever the plastic was fully removed, the furniture would still look brand new, even after years of use, over 2 decades, But people would just send for someone to come and rewrap it again if the plastic became too worn out and torn up, which could take years before that plastic would become worn out. And these are the type of jobs that actually got lost over time, where somebody would literally come to your house and, cut your plastic off. If it was already worn out and tearing up, and they would rewrap your couch and stuff again. They would come to your house. They knew because they knew that you couldn't bring it. It would be too much trouble. They would need a warehouse and all of this. And back then they were really about saving money. So it was easier for them to come to your house as opposed to you packing up your stuff, which you probably didn't have a truck to do that, finding their warehouse, bringing it to their warehouse, and their warehouse have to have all of these things, labeled and this and that, and have to have a place to put your furniture in storage until they got to it. And it was just so much. So it was just easier for the people who worked on wrapping plastic and doing it to come to your house and do it. And they would bring all of everything that they needed right there. So that's how a lot of them, if they didn't buy it already wrapped, a lot of people had it wrapped later. And I'm going to tell you, it saved a lot of money. It saved a lot of money. You never had to worry about it. And I'm going to tell you, the couches were made of such good quality. You didn't have to worry about sitting in the middle of the couch and it sinking down, your knees in the air and your butt's all the way down near the floor. You didn't have that type of furniture. This stuff they're making now is crap. And they're selling it for $2,000, $3,000, and $4,000. They don't have, the wood on these furniture that they was making back then was good wood. They didn't even have to worry about the wood ever wearing out. No matter how much it slid across that floor, them wooden legs would not give way. You literally almost had to take a sledgehammer to these couches in order to tear them up. But the couches and stuff they make today, all you got to do is sleep in them for a few months or sit down on them for a few months, and the couch gives way, the arm stuff falling off, the fabric on it is no good, and it's just, they don't make stuff like they used to. So basically you're getting way less quality, and you're paying top-notch dollar for it now, versus what they were paying back in the day. So that just gives you a little something. Now that everyone was happily in the house, E's parent told E and her siblings to go wash their hands and come to the dinner table for breakfast. E could already smell the best meal cooking in the air throughout her grandparents' house. She also could smell the scent of fresh perked dark coffee for the adults. During those days, parents forbade any child under 18 years old to drink coffee. Parents and grandparents said coffee was really bad for developing bodies and teeth. And they were really into health and teeth, I'm going to tell you. People growing up in the 60s and 70s had some good teeth, and their health wasn't like the kids are today. We were healthy kids. So in addition to that, the coffee, in addition to the coffee having too much caffeine for children, so many adults back then were pretty strict about not allowing any minors to drink coffee, any sort of coffee. Most home-cooked breakfasts back then had to be well balanced and have multiple choices. By the time E and them were finished eating, they headed straight outside to play with their friends. It was a good thing that they would immediately go out and play, because they would work off and burn away all of that heavy food they just ate. This way, it was less chance of unwanted weight gain, and you were never hungry again until about dinner time, which would be approximately 7 to 8 hours later. But until dinner time, kids would normally find something quick and small to consume if they needed to during that time, and just continue playing almost nonstop. But a breakfast that fulfilling would provide hours of energy. So you're talking about grits, eggs, sausage, bacon, biscuits, toast. Um, like they said, it was balanced most of the time. So you had apples. Most of the time you have apples with it, or a slice of a half of a banana. Applesauce was the main ingredient, that most of the time the main side dish, or shall we say side dessert, most of the time that was given. It's some milk and orange juice along with their cup of coffee. The adults would have their cup of coffee, and it would be small, dainty cups of coffee, not mugs. Okay, so we went from being real healthy back then, adults and parents, to, really having more and more cases of diabetes, clogged arteries, things of that nature. So we need to go back to the way they were doing things back then. I mean, because even though they said, oh, well, that was a heavy meal, grits with gravy, or grits and eggs, and anything with grits in it, and bacon, that was pork or whatever. But you had fruit to go with it to push that through where it would not sit in your system. So applesauce was known to push it through. And of course, the best kind of applesauce was cinnamon applesauce. And then you had apples, whole apples. That the story, the saying of an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Well, it did. You had orange juice, 100% orange juice. And I don't know if you remember that old Tropicana glass bottle. Orange juice used to always come in a glass bottle. And you would drink it in small cups, not big cups. Tropicana orange juice, those are the things that push the food through. So when you had that multiple combination of things, you didn't have to worry about unwanted fats sitting on your system and you gaining weight, and especially kids back then, because they couldn't wait to go outside. So, things were a lot different growing up back then. After some catching up with all her buddies, E and her friends decided they wanted to do a little skating around the block. Next, they all sat on E's grandmother's front cement steps and played a game called Dumb School. Dumb School was a game where you needed steps or staircase to play. You would choose who was going to be the teacher, while everyone else remaining would be the students. Next, all the students would sit side by side on either the ground or floor in front of the first step. The ground or floor represented kindergarten, and of course the first step represented first grade. You would go up as high as the number of steps you have, but not to ever exceed 12, no matter how many steps you may have. The 12th step, of course, represented 12th grade. Moving on, the teacher would then find or get a small object that they could completely hide in a closed fist, so no one would be able to see what they had in their hand. Next, while all students are sitting on the floor, the teacher will either turn their back to the students or simply put their hands behind their back. These techniques were done so the students couldn't see which hand the object was hidden in or being hidden in. When the teacher was ready, they would then face students sitting on the ground or move their hands back towards the front of them, where the students can now see both of the teacher's hands. The teacher will keep both hands in a closed fist so that no one can see which hand they're hiding the small object in. The teacher is never to cheat and must always be honest and fair about the next step of dumb school. Afterwards, the teacher will hold both fists out in front of each student, one at a time, while each student carefully examines both fists, trying to guess which fist is holding the object. It's okay for the students to touch the fist because the object should be so small enough to where there would be no difference in the closure of the fist. So no one would be able to guess the correct hand using that type of an exam method anyway. It's always best to keep the fist lightly closed or relaxed. This way, the person playing the teacher doesn't begin getting tired and begin slightly giving away which hand holds the small object. As the teacher goes to each student sitting on the ground or floor, the student that picks the correct hand advances to the next step up. The teacher will have to allow each student to have a chance, which means the teacher will have to secretly hide the small object in their hand again each time the next student can try, so the next student can try to pick the right hand. Sometimes the teacher can choose to leave the small object in the same hand or change hands, but that's the challenge of the game. The student will have to try to determine if the teacher changed hands or not. If the student picks the wrong hand, they remain where they're sitting until their turn comes around again. And, I looked up this game all on Google. I could not find it. So I'm thinking this was some sort of made up game for, I would say a lot of the inner city kids up north, more so. Okay, the teacher must continue moving back and forth in the same sequence from one student to the next, like I said before, until the first student reaches the very top step. No matter what grade the top step represents, the first student to reach it will now choose to become the new teacher, or if not, the game will go on till the next student reaches the top step. When there is a new teacher, the game starts all over from kindergarten again. You can keep playing the game over as many times as your little heart contents and as you would like. Some kids added to that game by stating once you get to the top step, you had to come all the way back down to kindergarten the same way you went up to the top step in order to win the game. Those who didn't have any steps to play the game, they would stand side by side and either take a step forward or backwards each time they guessed right. And that's how many kids, again, like I said, up north in Philadelphia, back in the 70s, played a made-up hand game called Dumb School. And, that's why I felt the need to make sure you understood what Dumb School was, because some things you just can't look up on the internet and expect to see it. So it just gives you an idea. Like I said, a lot of people would probably still be able to relate to that, and a lot of people won't, because the experiences of growing up are different for everyone. So that's why it's best to have laid it out, the way they did in here. So after a while of playing Dumb School, Ian and her friends became bored and decided to play baseball using a mop or broomstick with a green tennis ball. Okay, here we go. We're going back again in time. Because the tennis ball was soft and they had to play in the small streets lined with parked cars and row homes on one side of the street, along with the occasional passing cars and pedestrians, a soft tennis ball will cause next to no damage or injury to anyone or anything that it might hit. Unlike a real baseball, which is really hard, or a softball, which is also hard and bigger. So it was much smarter to play with a soft tennis ball in the inner city streets. After a while, Ian and her friends joined a few other little boys and girls in a game of baseball. The bases were set up on the sidewalks and across the street. Now remember, they use anything for bases: a cardboard, a piece of paper, a rock, a pole that sit on the sidewalk, anything they would use for bases. So it wasn't your professional bases that you see, the big square pillow looking things, or the triangle shaped, hard plastic things that would you see in a baseball field that go in the dirt. No, these kids were creative. They made their own bases. And it was okay. And it was mentally understood that everybody was going to be okay with it, and everyone was. E and M used another small street to play that was opposite of the street they used to do hopscotch and other games called skulls. Now, if you think about it, they were smart, because the kids who wanted to play hopscotch and skulls, well, they would be in the way of the kids who wanted to play baseball. So they had two different streets. See, this is what I meant when I say the streets in the inner city was the kids' playground. They didn't have access to playgrounds immediately, within the vicinity. And a lot of times the kids couldn't go too far from home. So too far from home would put them, would put a playground too far away. So the streets, these small streets, one-way streets normally, became their playground, which was smart. These kids, I'm going to tell you, when they were growing up, they had their things organized. We are not going to play on the same street that we do hopscotch and skulls. I'm going to tell you what skulls is. Skulls, which also is required to draw a box with a skull in the middle on the street. But skulls required old milk caps filled with street tar in order for the tops to be weighted down to smoothly slide or glide on the street when you pluck them from your fingers to get it into one of the chalk drawings or painted boxes of the game in the street. Now, how did they get that tar? Most of the time it was hot outside, and the edges of the tar back then was so easy to pick at. And they would pick at it using a stick or an old metal spoon, and they would take those little pieces and pack them inside the red tops or white tops or whatever tops they had from a gallon of milk. And they would pack it in there, and that give that top some weight. And that's how they did things back then. That's how they played. They, telling you, kids were amazing back then. So, and actually, moving on, they called it skulls because normally you would paint or draw a skull in the big box in the middle of the game, which is the box you would need to get your top inside of in order to win. However, you got to remember, you will also need to knock your opponents away to keep them from getting to the box, to the big box, as they could do the same to you. So that was the challenge, and, of that particular game. Some people also called that game tops because that's what you're using, tops. And tops was almost the remake or the offset of marbles, because marbles, you kind of did the same thing. Yeah, I don't know if you really remember, marbles had the same concept. But these kids, again, they were brilliant. Marbles rolled all over the place. They often got lost, and people were slipping on them or whatever. Kids, little toddlers get to them and they swallow them, and they had to get use the Heimlich maneuver to get it out. And some kids stick, little toddlers would stick the little marbles up their nose, and it was just too much. So they came up with a game called Tops, and it was more fun than the marbles. So that was a good thing. So no matter what, E and her friends always found something to do. No matter what. It was never a dull moment for these group of little friends. It was never a dull moment for these little people. Getting back to the ball game though. The ball game was underway. They all still had to be mindful of the occasional car traffic that would travel down that small one-way street. At this time, the bases were loaded with a person on first, E being on second base, which meant E would have to run across the small street to get to the other side where third base was. I tell you, they had it going on here. And another person was on third base. And because home base was located on the same side as second base, if E and the other teammates wanted to run to home base, they would need to cross the street again, coming from third base, to get back home to home base. So you had to cross the street twice. One of E's teammates was up for the bat. The other team playing the outfield started yelling things such as, "He can't hit," just to mentally distract the batter so he can miss hitting the ball and possibly bringing everyone on the bases home. So they didn't want him to hit, bring anyone home or hit a home run or anything. So they do little things to mess with you, your psychological mental state, to make you miss the ball when you try to hit it. E and the others who were standing on the bases were all in a still running stance, like they're waiting to take off running as fast as they could to the next base in hopes of them all making it to home base. Tension and anxiousness was at its peak as their teammate prepared and positioned his bat, which is really a mop stick, to hit the ball as hard as he could. Everyone around, excluding the opposing team, became very quiet as E's teammate was preparing himself both mentally and physically to hit the ball hard and far enough in order for him to bring all his teammate members on the loaded bases home, while he at least tries to get to first base if he doesn't get a home run. The ball goes up for the hit. Trying to ignore the opposing team's loud taunts, the batter swings. Only the sound of the mop stick waving at the air is heard. The opposing team cheers loudly at his first strike. Then they began chanting, "Strike two coming!" E and the others take a deep breath in anticipation as they remain on the bases due to their team now only having 2 strikes left, in hopes that the batter can bring them all home, which would, give them a lot of points, because each time a person, of course, we know baseball, each time a person hits home base or gets to home base, that's a point, So more determined than ever, the batter repositions himself at the home plate. He gets in his stance to knock the ball beyond outfield, meaning the outfielders will have to run much further to retrieve the ball, which would give E and the others, as well as himself, a chance to run all the way to home base, non-stop. Again, the tennis ball goes up in the air to be hit by the batter, as everyone's eyes gradually follows the ball as it comes down to the eye length of the batter. Silence sweeps the entire playing area on both sides. One team hoping he hits the ball, while the other team prays for him to miss the ball. Despite the eerie and nerve-wracking silence, the batter remains mentally calm, adamant, and focused. The ball is now in the position the batter needs it. The batter takes one step back, raises his stick higher, preparing to make another attempt to hit the ball without getting another strike. With all his might, the batter swings. A loud, hard smack and pop sound can be heard all around the area. It sounds as though the tennis ball has burst, as if he hit that ball so hard he busted it. And E and the other teammates began to run like their lives depended on it, despite the ball might have actually busted. But that doesn't stop the game. The ball will still be in play. However, out of nowhere, a car came down the street with slightly accelerated speed. But all the kids had tunnel vision and were focused on how far the ball was hit in the air so they could make it to home base. However, another friend of the block, in other words, in the neighborhood, quickly stood up and out of fear, with all their might, with their loudest vocal cords, frantically yelled out to everyone, "Car!" By the time anyone paid any attention to the person yelling "car," as that's what they would do when cars would come, E and the other teammates were already trying to make it to home base. The driver, realizing he was going a little too fast on such a small street where kids play and could possibly run out in the street, the car's tires made a very loud and somewhat long screeching sound. The kids all immediately stopped. Neighbors and other adults who were all enjoying the game from their porches like normal, all immediately, out of concern and great concern and fear, stood up to see what happened. Then someone shouted, "Ooh, that car hit E." Everyone from around the area came running. E was laying still underneath the car. One of the adults yelled, "Someone hurry and go tell her mama what happened." The elders cautiously surrounded the car and the driver, just in case the driver would get scared and try to pull away or run from the scene. Other adults began writing down the license plate number and what the driver looked like. Someone else called the police and ambulance. This time, there was no secret for E and Beans to keep from anyone. Because if you read the last chapter, that's what E and Beans did. They kept the secret of, E almost getting hit before. And, missing it by the skin of her teeth. But this time, that couldn't happen. Couldn't stay a secret. This incident was going to be known to everyone. After Beans finally ran as fast as she could up the street to E's grandmother's house to tell E's family what was currently happening to E down the street, E's mother's heart sunk with fear. And the rest of E's family all immediately ran out the house frantically and began hurrying down the street, where they could see a big crowd of people beginning to gather in the middle of the street. E's mother's knees could barely hold her body up to walk down the street as the worst thoughts of E being hit by a car continued crossing her mind over and over. But nevertheless, E's mother pushed on till she made it down the street with the rest of the family. Everyone not only saw all of E's family trotting and running down the street towards them, but they could also hear the loud sirens of the police and ambulance someone had called, quickly coming closer to the crowd of people standing around in the street. E was still laying motionless under the car. E's family arrived shortly before the first responders, and all E's mother could see was E's small 8-year-old foot protruding from underneath the front end of the car. The rest of E's body was completely under the car. E's mother got on her knees and began calling out for E to answer her because she knew moving E wasn't medically advisable. Also, E's grandmother told E's mother, don't try to move her because she could make matters medically worse for E. E's grandmother, by the way, was a registered nurse. E's father and other family members all gathered around E's mother, who was kneeling on the ground in front of the car. E's mother realized E wasn't answering nor showing any movement and let out the loudest wailing of a mother's worst fear. E's father and Uncle Cooley began consoling E's mother, while E's grandmothers began consoling E's sisters and brother, who were also crying. Bean's family members and the other adults who also knew the children all joined the crowd. Beans began crying so uncontrollably, because that was her best friend. Beans, Beans and E were best of friends. She was crying so uncontrollably that her aunt had to hold and console her. Her aunt also came down the street. Of course, they all knew it. They all knew E. They all knew each other. The cries and wails of sorrow began swiftly making its way through the crowd of people who knew E and her family. During this time, the police and ambulance had arrived. Because the police was very experienced in situations involving a growing crowd of people and a child being hit by a car, the police immediately put the driver of the car in the back of their police cruiser in order to protect the driver from the possible violent reactions of bystanders or the victim's family members and friends. The police also quickly secured the scene so that the ambulance technicians could do what they needed to do to help E. While the ambulance people were tending to E, the police began talking to all the adults and other kids who saw the whole thing, while at the same time, they were also getting the driver's side of the story. After the police began to hear the worsening sounds of chatter and wailing, in addition to the continuous growing crowd, the police called in for more police support, backup basically, in order to protect the perimeter and the people. The police needed to keep the area free and clear for the ambulance people so they could carefully remove E from underneath the car. As E's mother's wailing turned into the sounds of a child crying as if they were denied something they really liked, the police felt it was best for E's mother to stand aside so the ambulance people could get E from under the car. Police also began directing people to back up away from the scene to give the ambulance people room to immediately start working on E. The EMT slowly began maneuvering E's body from under the car until they finally were able to get E's full body from under the car and out on the street where they could better assess E's condition and health status. They began with taking her vital signs to see if E was still alive. While assessing E's vital signs, to the surprise of the EMTs, police, E's family, and friends, E's eyes popped wide open. At the same time, E inhaled and exhaled a big breath of oxygen and then began being confused. E looked around at everyone, looking down at her. And E then proceeded to try to get up and stand so she could walk home. But the EMT workers gently braced their hands on E and advised that she lay still until they were finished assessing her. E reluctantly complied. When E's mother, family, friends, bystanders, the driver, and police saw E try to get up, they all let out very loud cheers, cries, and tears of joy. The driver put his hands together and thanked God for letting E be all right. It was one of the loudest sighs of relief anyone could imagine. EMT workers asked E if she was hurting anywhere and if she felt like she could stand or walk. E told them she felt fine. And that was the end of chapter 4 of Still Surviving Cars at 8 years old. Now, you have to wonder again. This was the second time, maybe a month later, that E was almost hit by a car. Now, in this case here, she basically fainted and the car went over her. She fainted seconds before the car hit her. Seconds. And that's how she ended up underneath the car, because she fainted as the car was still skidding. But just seconds before that front end of that car hit any part of her little 8-year-old body. And she laid there. It was as if, okay, who laid her? Because she did not realize that car was coming until the last minute, and the car didn't realize she was going to run out in that street until the last minute. So we have to look at these things. Again, you know, it goes back to what we said. An unusual kind. That 1%. What is it? What type of force, blessings, or luck does this little girl have where she's almost hit twice, I was saying within a month, and each time she survives it? Somehow, the first time she got hit, just a month prior, we could say, or we could say 4 weeks prior or something, the car just hit her, but her body went down. But for some reason, the car didn't hit her hard enough to where she wouldn't be able to get up and run. But this time, she gave everybody a scare, and this time the car would have hit her had, for some reason, she not fainted. That's why when she opened her eyes, she didn't know what was happening. She didn't know anything. She was wondering why people was looking at her, and she was like, I'm fine. What's wrong with y'all? You know, and people looking like, well, we're happy you're fine, but god darn, how did you escape that? You talking about seconds from the car hitting her, where it looked like the car hit her, but she had fainted and laid there. That's why she was motionless under that car. You know, we have to look at these things and just wonder. And see, this again, it goes back to an unusual kind. Where does these people come from? Where do they start? You know, how do they even begin? And this is where they begin. This is how they start. And we don't even realize it until they're up and way up in their adulthood, till they've had children. But when you look back on even yourselves or people you've known, you wonder how they miraculously got out of things. You ever wonder how somebody who's so clumsy, and you'd be like, you know, I wonder how you even made it through life as clumsy as you are. You know, and you have to wonder, are they one of those 1%ers? Are they one of the ones that it appears that God has their hand on them all the time? And he's with them more so than anyone else. I mean, he's with everybody. But he has the ones he really knows he need to watch. Maybe because he feels they're carefree people, clumsy people, as we would call them. You know, maybe he feels that they're going to be significant in the future, but he got to keep them alive to get there. you know. So anyway, that's the end of chapter 14. Still surviving cars at 8 years old. And until next time, people, I want you all to enjoy your lives. Stay wary, stay optimistic, stay open and alert, and be ever so mindful of yourself and others, especially children that you might have or children you might know that are growing up similar to some of the experiences of E. And as we go deeper into the stories, you will hear a lot more. And then you'll be like, okay, now we heard about E's great-grandparents, E's grandparents, E's mom. Okay, so everybody, you know where they're coming from. Because E, her great-grandmother, is the daughter of a 100% Cherokee Indian. You know, and E's I would say her great-grandfather was the husband to the Cherokee, black Cherokee Indian, and he came from West Africa. So the great-great-grandmother, who was the Cherokee Indian, was already here in the U.S. And her great-great-grandfather was forced over into slavery, you know, somewhere from West Africa. And that's where the great-great-grandfather met the great-great-grandmother, who she was, you know, again, 100% black Cherokee. And they had children, and then thus E's great-grandmother was born. And then E's great-grandmother had kids, and then E's grandmother was born. And then E's grandmother had kids, and then E's mother was born, and then E's mother had kids, and then E was born. So E's about a 5th generation down from her great-great-grandparents who were in slavery. And her great-grandmother, who was born just right there at the cusp of slavery, who was probably a baby when slavery was ending. And by the time slavery ended, she might have been, you know, I don't know, maybe 5, 8 years old, you know, somewhere around that time. I don't know, maybe younger. But either way, E's descendants, she's a descendant of some pretty great people, special people, who were born and subjected to some very special and hard times. So we got to keep all of that in mind. That's why the story of, you know, an unusual kind, that 1%, goes all the way back to the beginning. So you can find out who these people are. How did they become? Why are they who they are? Just as, I mean, think about it. Jesus is from the bloodline of King David. And I think Jesus was born almost like 1,000 years later. Somewhere like that. You know, we have to read the Bible. But yes, he's in the bloodline of King David because of Jesus' mother, Mary. She was in the bloodline of King David. So, and then look who Jesus became. Look how God used him. But look how far down the line it was before God decided he wanted to use him. He knew ahead of time that he was going to use him. But look how God had to make all of these preparations just so he can get that perfect son that he needed. That perfect human being that he needed. Or at least almost perfect, more perfect than any human being on earth that has ever walked earth and that's on earth right now. So anyway, without further ado, again, you all stay blessed. Until the next time, we're going to come up with chapter 15.